What's good, everybody? Welcome back to the What in the Word podcast. As you can see, we have a new host on the show that's as jizzy as we know him in the streets. And today we want to talk about something that's big in our culture today, which is deconstruction of faith. I want to first start out by saying that, we are empathetic to certain people who are going through certain challenges with their faith, and we know that this is not a monolith of people, even though sometimes when we look on social media and various other places, it might seem that way. But we really want to be as what's the word I'm looking for? We want to be as loving as we can. We don't want to typecast people, but we still want to try and talk about some of the things that we've seen when it comes to people deconstructing their faith away from Christianity, because we do believe that we have truth, and and so we just want to be as loving as possible. At the same time, we don't want to just lump everybody into the same bucket, but we do want to speak what truth that we believe uh, is available for those who will hear, and maybe somebody who's uh, deconstructing right now, reconstructing. We just want to be a resource for that right now. You have anything you want to say, SJ?
Yeah, I kind of the same thing. I don't think that it's either of our heart to like tear into somebody and be like, "Haha, you're stupid because you don't believe in Christianity anymore." Um, but I and I think that for a lot of people, um, myself included, you always have those seasons of like doubt or seasons where questions come up and maybe you can't find the answers. And the easy thing to do is just be like, well, I guess I don't believe anymore. And so the hope is that we can share truth so that if you're going through those struggles, you're able to know what the truth is and maybe get some answers to some of those questions.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, if you have to say like one of the main reasons that you see people who are struggling or having these faith questions, what are some things that you're seeing and witnessing, whether it be online or even in personal relationships? What are some things that you're seeing happening?
One thing I've noticed is that it's very rare that you get someone who gave their life to Christ later in life and then deconstructs. A lot of times it's the kids who grow up in church. The kids who grow up in church are either forced to go to church or maybe they like going to church, but they were raised in it. And then they slowly start to have doubts and they never made that faith their own faith.
Mm,
It was just kind of their mom and dad's faith. And so a lot of them will start to have questions and they never get those answers. Sometimes I think the church does a disservice by trying to shove aside questions that some people may have, whether it be doubts or anything, where it's just like, oh, you got to have faith. And that doesn't always sit well in your brain of like, but wait, there's so many conflicting
yeah,
ideas here. So,
yeah, absolutely. Um, would you say that oftentimes you've witnessed um, people who struggle? Often these struggles are with essentials versus distinctives. Sometimes that's one thing that I'm seeing often is um, people who are wrestling with things often aren't wrestling with essentials of the faith, but it's like their worldview has been shaken in some way, sort of fashion, and now they're wrestling with the things that aren't really, I would say, pivotal or critical to faith, but they're I don't I'm trying to say this again as respectfully as possible, but a lot of times what I'll see is people who are deconstructing over things that are not essential, non sequiturs, not essential to what we believe. Have you witnessed any of that?
yeah, I think that a there's a lot of things that happen. One is, like I said before, like a lot of the times it's not someone who gave their life to Christ later in life. It's someone who grew up in the faith. And I think going out into the world and you start to um, meet people who have different beliefs than you, and your natural human instinct is like, oh, well, I love this person. But then when you have a skewed vision of what the gospel is, you say, oh, but my religion says I'm not supposed to like
Mm,
you. So you start to struggle with that dichotomy of like, uh, love the sinner, hate the sin. Your
Mm,
brain will struggle with that because oftentimes in our culture today, we connect our identity to so many things that have nothing to really do with what our identity should be wrapped up in.
mm,
And so, um, oh, well, this person smokes weed, and so if I don't like the fact that they smoke weed or whatever, then I can't like them. But rather, like, oh, you can still love them as a Christian. Like, it's nothing in the gospel that says like, and cut off all people who smoke weed, and
right.
cut off all people who may have same sex attraction, and cut off all people who may struggle with this thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect and total sense. Uh, what are some other things that you've seen that maybe someone who's listening to this podcast who's in the midst of deconstructing their faith uh, might benefit from hearing from a person who you said earlier we're challenged. All of us are challenged with faith at times. What would you think someone listening now who's uh, starting to, because you grew up in the church, obviously, not obviously, but you grew up in
I did,
the
yes.
church. And so, what would be some things that you could tell someone who's wrestling with these thoughts right now?
I would just say like one, you're not alone
Mm,
because there's lots of people who may put on a face, but they're also struggling with the same questions that you may have. I struggle with a lot of questions. One of the analogies that I've heard is deconstruction can be helpful as long as you're willing to take away the pieces that don't fit and reconstruct the building. Like if you're building a Lego and you're following the instructions, you're building like the Batmobile or something like that.
yeah,
Uh, and a piece isn't fitting, then you need to back up and say like, "Oh, where did I go wrong in the instructions?" Rather than just crushing the Batmobile and be like, "Well, I don't even want to build this thing anymore," you know.
right.
And so I went through some of the same struggles. I had lots of questions. I went through a phase of like almost agnosticism, even though I kind of still believed in God, but I was just like questioning everything.
Mm,
And so I went through that phase, and then I came to the conclusion that like, okay, there's enough evidence for me to put my belief in God. And then I started to question some of the like more, like you said, the stuff that's not really that important, and kind of came to my own belief. But the important part was that I was able to put pieces back together. And sometimes that just comes down to like asking the questions that you're scared to ask. So I would encourage anyone out there who's struggling with questions to ask the questions to people that you know may have answers, or maybe they don't have answers. But if you're in a good community of believers, they would hopefully say, let's figure out those answers together.
yeah, yeah. And I don't know if you've ever experienced this personally, but I know a lot of people have. When people wrestle with uh, the way that other Christians are, whether it be church abuse or things of that nature. Um, I found recently in my, again, researching for this topic, looking at different videos online, speaking to different people, um, I I've seen a lot of times where we're communal in our nature, like people want to be in community. You know, we often say that people who are introverted or people who don't want to be around people, we often think of that as something that's not natural to humans because we like to be in community and around other people to some degree, to some degree. And so, um, often what I've experienced as well is people will um, be hurt by certain individuals or who are in leadership in the church or things of that nature, and then they throw out the proverbial baby with the bathwater, if you will. They stop believing based upon the behaviors of other believers. What would you say to someone who is struggling with that aspect of, well, if these people are truly Christian and following the teachings of Jesus, then why do they behave the way that they do, and why can't they just live out what they say they believe?
Yeah, I think as humans, our brains are really good at coming up with shortcuts to questions we may have. And I think that it doesn't take that many people to have wronged you for you to like throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Right.
Um, yeah, it doesn't really take a lot. like millions of people on the planet, and let's say you live in New York City, 3 people say the wrong thing to you, and all of a sudden, they're like, "I hate people. People are the worst,"
Oh, I
right?
hate New
Even though
Yorkers.
yeah, I
Yeah,
hate New Yorkers. I
right,
went there, 3 people were rude to me, even though there's, like, millions of people in the city.
right.
And so I think the same thing can happen with any group of people. So you're in a Christian community and you had 3 people who wronged you, or hurt you in some way, and it leaves you feeling like, oh, well, Christians are just, judgmental, or Christians are just this way or that way. And it doesn't take a lot to make you start to think that all of them are like that. I would just encourage that you keep meeting new people, because anywhere you go, you're going to meet bad apples.
Right.
And so, uh, yeah, don't throw the baby out with the bath. Don't be like, oh, well, all Christians don't even believe what they say, because there's millions across the globe who do uh, actively live out the gospel and actively fight for things. Not to say anyone's perfect, but they actively are doing the things that has called them to do. And so often we meet like 3 that don't, and we're like, ah, Christians, you
Yeah,
know. And I
yeah,
think our brains are good at that, and they're wired to make shortcuts so that we can hold the least amount of information in our heads as possible so we don't short circuit.
yeah. That's good. That's good, and we do tend to do that. Even if the numbers were greater than three, even if it's 1,000 out of the billions of people on the planet,
Yeah.
we tend to. Um, I know there's a lot of people now who are counseling people and things of that nature based upon what they say about social groups, right? Like, and our bodies are hard. I mean, our brains are hardwired to try and take the path of least resistance to put people into categories. It's almost like a computer. Um, but one thing that I would say to people who are wrestling and struggling with certain things is to realize that the Bible and Christianity, the Bible displays that the Christian faith is filled with people who are marred, who are challenged. And I think it really stands to reason, if you have a biblical worldview, that our world is full of sin. And even though we continue to not be perfect in many areas of our life, there was only one perfect person to ever walk the planet, and his name was Jesus, if I can remember correctly. And the Bible shows that there's a lot of uh, people who wrestled with their faith, but were still pillars in the community who promoted faith and still love God. I mean, look at people like John the Baptist. Look at people like David, where um, they wrestle with things, and we shouldn't be any different. I think if the Apostle Paul uh, would coin some more letters um, than the ones that we have, which are sufficient. But if you were to coin some more letters in the vein of Romans 7, we would really be able to see his life. But his life wasn't about showing himself; his life was about showing others Christ. But in Romans 7, we talked about this. Me and you had this discussion the other day, and everybody else, y'all not privy to our father son confidentiality conversations. That Romans 7 is really explicit in Paul saying that he knows what is right to do, but it's still a challenge to do it, and to find grace in people who have hurt other people. I've been wronged by people, and I'm sure I've wronged other people, not intentionally sometimes, and sometimes maybe even intentionally, that I want grace for. And so not to just beat people over the head because they can't live out the perfect life because no one can, right? Um, in your research or anything, is there any other things that you've seen as you look around the internet or talk to friends who are deconstructing? What are some things that stand out to you that you would like to talk to in this time?
Yeah. Um, One other thing that I've sort of noticed is when whenever you feel like you've been enlightened
Mm,
on something,
right.
you feel the need to discourage the old way of thought.
Yeah.
So a lot of what I was seeing online when I was looking at these deconstruction videos was a lot of people who had this like feeling of like, oh, I know the truth now. I've been enlightened, and everyone else who's still a Christian is like barbaric in their way of thinking because now I have this new enlightenment. Um, and again, not trying to uh, bash people, but that's kind of a good feeling, right? If you were raised one way and you're kind of rebelling and you're
Yeah.
like, I know the new trend to do, it kind of puts you in like in the know,
Yeah.
even if it's like majority of people are religious, majority of people on the planet are,
Yeah.
and atheism or agnosticism is like the minority of people.
Right.
You feel like, yeah, well, I'm in the know because, everyone else is just not thinking the right way. And so I think that the more that kind of stuff gets shared, the more it seems like kind of enticing of
Yeah.
being like, I want to be one of the cool people who
Right.
don't need no religion to come up with moral foundations. Um, and I think that, and then also accompanied with sometimes it's just, well, I want to live the way I want to live.
Mm.
I don't want to be tied down to the things that Christianity will tell me that is right and wrong. I just want to kind of do it. And I think sometimes maybe, whether in secret or not, there are probably people who struggle with sin and they struggled so much that they kind of numbed the voice of the Holy Spirit,
Right.
and they're kind of just like, oh, okay. Now you're just out so far that you don't hear God anymore because you're just running from him. Um, and then it just kind of falls to the wayside of like, oh yeah, I used to be a Christian way back when, but not anymore.
I've evolved past that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting you said that when you speak about the in crowd. Um, it's so funny to me that um, there's a rise in this type of thinking, um, and not just again. I don't want to throw everybody, lump everybody in, but it's a rise in the thinking of people who grew up in the church who are now deconstructing. It feels like to me, um, in a season where it seems like um, there's a lack of respect for authority, like you just alluded to some of those things, and not only that, there is no real gatekeepers on social influence. Like when I was growing up, I'm gonna show my age a little bit. I just turned 48, almost 50.
Sheesh.
Yeah, I know. Uh, I I can remember if you wanted to have like religious programming or church programming, you would have to go through one of the major networks. Now you can flip open your phone and you can voice any idea. People used to literally look for your credentials as a minister, things of that nature. No one does that now. So a lot of times I've seen as well bad theology hurting people and people not really going to the source of truth to uh, learn some of the things. And we live in this microcosm of society where there's a lack of authority, there's a lack of absolute truth. Like a lot of people don't believe that there's an absolute truth, my truth, your truth type of thing. And on top of that, this is cultural moment where people can be gatekeepers or authorities just because they can get a lot of people to gravitate towards their ideas, right? And the Bible is very explicit when it shares with us that we should be careful of all types of doctrines. Paul even writes to Timothy, says, beware as a pastor of these churches. There's doctrines of demons, right? There's things that will lead us astray, and we don't have the acumen sometimes even in the church to combat what you said earlier, those questions that people might ask. There might even be people in leadership in the church who can't answer these questions. And far gone is a day where we used to go through catechisms as the church, where we used to learn the oracles of the faith. That's why I think some people um, maybe knee-jerk reaction, maybe my generation and older, they knee-jerk reaction to new worship songs because they're like theology light, if you will, right?
Yeah.
That's why we say we want the old hymns that declared doctrinal truths as we sing and do worship, not to badmouth the younger generation, but it's like we really are in a society now that feels biblically illiterate on a lot of things. It's just knowing context, not being able to answer questions. Um, and a lot of the things, I'm going to be honest, these are the people who kind of get a knee jerk reaction out of me is when I look at TikTok or YouTube Shorts or Instagram, and a person summarizes the Christian faith in a 30-second snippet based on a misunderstanding.
Yeah.
And so that's challenging to me. And we often try and write our cultural moment into the biblical context, not understanding that if we lived in the times where certain people live, we would have behaved and acted the same way as they do. And then here's the scary part, SJ. Uh, you're a parent now. Think about um, growing up in your granny's day and age, right? And saying, "Oh my God, I would never do what they did."
Yeah.
Eventually, you're going to be the granddad. And your grandkids are going to say, "Oh, my granddad was so." And we don't, the Bible just gives us biblical truths without cultural moments. And so we need to be able to dive into this, what this podcast is for, what in the word, uh, to be able to live out biblical truths outside of our moment in time. That makes sense?
Yeah. Yeah. I think uh, going into that whole, I guess, TikTok arc, I'm the younger generation.
Yeah,
Uh,
get them.
but a lot of what I see on like TikTok and some of the social media stuff is, and I'm the kind of guy who I see it and it like infuriates me because I'm like, this person doesn't know what they're talking about. What are they talking about? But I'm
Yeah,
not really a person who's like, I'm going to confront them. I need to put in the comments, and
right.
I'm not that kind of person. I'll just like talk about it with friends and be like, you've seen this TikTok? But one of the things that's crazy is so many people on social media claiming to have credentials that I question.
Okay.
I
Yeah.
question very hard whether or not they actually have those credentials that
Right.
they say they do. I can't prove it. There's people on there who say, I'm a historian, and I believe this figure never existed. And
Right.
it's like, uh, what are you talking about? And I think going back to like the older generations, there was a good um, amount of social control that would happen.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, you're in a group of friends. If you decide to do something absolutely wild, your friends are gonna be like, "Okay, you're crazy. Stop doing that.
Right.
You're acting like a fool."
Right.
Whereas now, if you're acting crazy or acting like a fool, like if you're someone who's like, "I like to eat dirt." Back then, it was like, "Stop eating dirt." Now you can find a forum online of dirt
Of
eaters
dirt eaters.
who
Yes.
all eat dirt and they're all cool with it. And
Yeah.
so you kind of get into these microcosms, or uh these um what's the word I'm looking for? Echo chambers of people who are all affirm those beliefs that you have.
Yeah. The Dirt Eaters Club.
Yeah. The
Yeah.
Dirt
And
Eaters
yeah,
Club.
that that's perfect. That's perfect. Um so help me as an older person now, being a granddad now, right? Looking at
Old.
old. Yes. Say it
Better be
again for
careful of those dirt eaters because you're pretty old at dirt.
yeah.
Yes.
So let's put it in context for uh my grandson's generation. Um how as a grandfather who wants to see the best for my grandchildren, how can I lean into some of these current cultural moments? How can I lean into a new term I learned the other day was hopefully agnostic. You know, people who I believe in a higher power. I believe that there's more to the universe. Uh,
But I
and
just
being a
can't know what that is.
was that
Or sorry, they believe in a higher power, but they just don't know what that
right,
is, or
right, right,
that truth's not accessible to
right.
them.
The truth that's not accessible. How do I, as a older dirt generation, look down uh, and pass uh, biblical truth to my children and grandchildren in a way that infuses life and uh, the Christian way to them.
Um, I guess I would say that it's important to teach the younger generation how to think. One thing I learned from college, when I graduated, was critical thinking skills.
Mm,
I didn't get a job after college, like in my field or anything like that. But one thing I did gain from that experience was critical thinking skills, not taking everything at face value. Um, like I said before, all the people who say they have credentials in certain areas, when I watch those videos, red flags just start popping up like, I don't know about this. Um, but I think so many people just are like, "Oh, well, they said they're a historian, so Abraham Lincoln must have never existed,"
right.
right? And it's just like this outlandish, crazy stuff. And I think that an important thing is to teach them how to be Bible thinkers. When they hear
Mm,
things that are false doctrine, they're able to say, "Wait a second. Wait, hold on just 1 second. I don't know about
right.
that." Um, And I think being able to discern those things is super important, but I don't think a lot of people have that. They hear stuff online and they're like, "Oh, well, this person online said it and they have authority," which, like you said, it's not gate kept anymore.
Right.
Like you can say you're a historian and there's no peer reviewed papers that you've ever gotten like into a article, but for some reason we're just trusting you because you made a 30-second TikTok about this thing. And I think it's important to teach the younger generation how to think and how to have those discerning moments of like, wait a second, this doesn't sound right. So let me go figure out if this is right.
Got you.
Um,
Got you.
because I think a lot of people are like, this doesn't sound right, but I mean, they know more than me. They went to college for history,
Right.
um, rather than going, this doesn't sound right. Let me look back to the history books. And
That's
so, in context of the Bible, this doesn't really sound right. This doesn't really sound like the character of God or the character of Jesus. So let me read the Bible and see what it
got you.
actually says.
Got you. You know, that's actually interesting. Uh, back way back in the day when I used to be into computer, when I was in the computer field, and I built websites. There was this concept that came out that was in regards to website development. Don't make me think. Also with software development, you know, you want everything to be so intuitive that you didn't have to think. Do you think do you think do you believe that that's something that is prevalent in the younger generation now is they're not deep thinkers? Uh, and if so, what are some of the things that you think contribute to some of that not uh, not thinking as deeply as, say, a person who didn't have a feed to scroll or you know other distractions?
Yeah, I think our we have our phones in our pockets at all times, so we don't actually have to think
Mm,
about things very often. We can just look up and hear different opinions on the subject and then just pick the one we like the best,
right.
like a buffet of information.
Mm,
Um, so many times it's crazy. I would when I was in school at in college, I would be having these little debates. I like to debate. I had a couple friends who like to debate, so it was never like we're arguing hardcore, but we would go back and forth. And so many times somebody would show me an article and then I would read it and then I would like just read the summary of the article. They were just looking at the headline and I would go, "This is proving my point."
yeah,
Like this
right,
article
right,
that you're showing me is proving my point. And
right.
I don't think we really want to dive deep into those topics. We just want like a quick
Yeah,
microwave answer.
yeah,
Look it up on Google and then it gives me like the headline of an article and I'm like, "Haha, see, this is proving my point." Um, but we don't actually read it or dive into it. And I think so often we hear these things that like creep into the church, even stuff as silly as like, well, the Bible says cleanliness is next to godliness.
it does not
So
say that.
you got to take a bath, and it's
Yeah,
like that. That's not in the Bible.
right.
You should take a bath. You don't want to be
Mm,
stinking, but
mm,
not a Bible verse. And so often I would just ask like, oh, which verse was that? And they were like, it's in there somewhere,
yeah,
right? But we don't want to think. We just want to like hear information and be able to repeat information to
right.
um, and on the web, on the internet, we just want to feel smarter than we are. So we'll look up something real quick and then get into these debates online. And it's not necessarily well thought out issues. It's just this one sounds better. And so I'm going to go with this one. And so I'm going to look up some stats that maybe support me. And then oftentimes it's like, nope, the research was done,
Right.
you know?
Yeah, that's awesome. And you know, taking it back to the word, I'm reminded of the scripture that tells us not to be tossed to and fro by every wind of doctrine,
Mm.
right? And I believe that, sometimes I get into I get into more discussions with people based upon principles than actual that current thing that we're talking about. Because I often see slippery slopes because I try and maintain a biblical worldview. And oftentimes I can see how it can come across as Pharisaic because I'm trying to guard against, okay, this is okay, this is moderately bad. But if you keep on down this line of thinking, you're going to get way over here, right? Kind of thing. And so I guess I'm more principled in nature. And I often see that when I try and teach truth based on biblical principles, I'm often shot down because it's often seen as pharisaical because we're not all designed to think alike, or we're individualistic in the West, in those type of things, where I'm looking more at a cultural landscape. And if we begin to do this in culture, then this is next. And a lot of people are like, well, humanity will never get back to you know nazi nazi concentration camps. However, I believe that the people in Germany probably thought that there would never come about Nazi concentration camps, right? And so, how much of our present moment, looking at today's culture, do you believe rest upon thinking? I think you said a little bit about this earlier. Thinking that this cultural moment is greater than the past, and we'll never go back and repeat the mistakes of the past.
I think that there's a trend in culture that wants to uproot the deconstruct the way the past did things.
Mm,
Because in our heads, we think we're so much more enlightened
yeah,
as time goes on. We're like, oh, we have cell phones. We are smarter than Aristotle.
yeah.
Um, not to say Aristotle was the smartest man in the world, but I think there's,
Well, there's something to be said about Aristotle and those guys who came up with concepts in their time than us building things in a time of Chat GPT.
yeah, like, yeah. So I was thinking about this the other day, this concept of the, ash the people who were astronomers back then and would track the skies.
Yeah,
That's way more impressive than I have a giant telescope that tracks it for me, or
yeah.
I have this technology
Oh, I
that can
have
do
the
things.
the app from Google that I can look up and go, "Oh, that's."
Yeah, that's Saturn right there.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
people who are actually there, like, charting the skies, that's probably took a lot more of, intelligence
yeah,
than we give them credit
no
for.
doubt.
Um, but I do think there's something to be said about, like, I think it's just in our nature to wanna rebel.
Yeah,
Like, from the beginning of time, we just wanna rebel from the people who are behind us.
right.
You don't know, you don't understand me, you don't understand my, uh the way that I wanna live. You're just barbaric, you're just in the past, you
Yeah.
know? But I think there is wisdom to take from older generations. When I was younger, I used to hate it when someone would say, like, "You'll understand when you get older." And
Mm,
I think we're just gonna I think I'm just gonna constantly be in a state of the people before me, the people who came before me can instill wisdom into me, but now I look back on other people who are, like, much younger and they say things and I'm like, "Ah, you'll understand in 7 years from
forget it.
now when you're my age," right? And I think, as people, whatever moment we're in right now, we think is the most enlightened we'll ever be.
Right, right,
I try to keep the posture of I'm always an idiot compared to the future me 10 years from now.
right.
And so 10 years from now, I'm going to look back and be like, man, I was an idiot. 10 years from then, I'm going to look back and be like, man, I was
And
really
I'm gonna be
dumb.
like, "You're a bigger idiot."
Yeah. Until the end of until my last breath, I'm probably going to look back and be like, man, I was real stupid back then.
Right,
But I
right.
think it's in our nature to just think that whatever moment we're in right now is the smartest we'll ever be,
Yeah,
but
I
it's not the case.
I think that's a great point, and I think that that summarizes a lot of things. You know, I often, even as I'm sharing on Sundays, uh, songs are hitting hit my brain. And when you were saying it a second ago, that old song my mama used to say, "Take your time, young man." Mama used to say, "Don't be in a rush to get old." Yeah, you see, you don't even remember the song, because if you remember the
No, I
song,
don't.
you'd be like, "Hey," you would start.
I have no clue what
Yeah,
that
yeah,
is.
yeah, you have no
Ever
context.
heard of David Crowder?
Mm,
Want to bring some of that up?
mm, 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 mm. So, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. We want to rebel, and the Christian worldview tells us that we are in a rebellious state, until um we see Jesus, right? Like we often have this, again, Paul wrote, this need to want to do good, but wrong is always there. And it's
Yeah.
this fight. And I think a lot of people want to be liberated from that fight. And like you said earlier, we numb ourselves uh, to these promptings of the Holy Spirit. And before you know it, we don't hear him anymore. And I got to be honest, I I've looked at and spoken to people who have deconstructed, and a lot of times it's been because they didn't want to receive an absolute authority over their lives. And I've even heard people say things like, if the God of the Bible is real, I still wouldn't want to follow him. Uh, and here's a here's a s- here's a scary thing: not wanting to follow him implies that you don't understand what the essence of the word God is.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I would still rebel against him even if you could prove him to me right now. I
Yeah.
still would not follow him. And so that speaks to me as a person. Possibly, I pray that these people are not like this, but possibly a seared conscience, which is a scary thought, to get to a place where your conscience is seared and you can no longer ascribe to there being something greater than me that um, would think differently than me, which essentially puts yourself in the place of God.
Yeah. That the reason why that scared me so much was I just think when you say like, oh, I even if you could prove to me that God existed, I still wouldn't follow him.
Hmm.
That just reminds me of like what the fallen angels,
Right.
they knew God existed. They knew that he was the true God, but they still didn't. It's all good. So, but yeah, the fallen angels, even the demons know that he's God and they tremble, right?
Right.
And so, in my head, when I hear the words, um, even if he was real, if you could prove that to me, I still
Mm,
wouldn't follow him. That's just such a strong statement that
mm.
puts me in mind of, yeah, that's probably where the fallen angels were at. It's like we know he's real and we don't want to follow him,
Yeah,
which is a scary thought for a human to be that far.
that's crazy. So we're about a half an hour into this,
Yeah.
and so I would love to be able to leave our listeners with some basic practical things that they can do if they find themselves in. And again, we don't want to belittle this, but we understand that this is a scary place.
Yeah.
That you find yourself in this scary place where everything that you've ever believed um, is at is in question now, and you're wrestling with what is true, what is real. Uh, we don't want to mitigate or minimize this in any way. So, what are some practical things for those who came up in the church like you did as a youth? Some who converted later in life, like me, um, and have had these thoughts. Um, what are some practical things that they can do in order to quote unquote deconstruct their faith in a healthy way?
Um, yeah, I think one thing is reading the word. I think that there's a lot of misconceptions, especially for people who grew up in the church,
Mm.
things that they think or they've heard, but that aren't actually in the Bible or it's not
Yeah.
actually the true gospel. And so reading it for yourself is really important if you want to be able to deconstruct in a healthy way, because then you're able to get rid of some of the bad apples that are
Right.
in your basket. Um, if um, Yeah, if there is like 3 poison apples in your basket of 10, you'd wanna get those out before you start chowing down, right? You
Right.
wanna,
Right.
be able to get the wrong doctrines out of there. Um, and I would also just say it's okay to struggle through those doubts.
Mm.
I think so often we want, like I said, like the microwave quick answers, and I would say from my experience, it takes a lot longer than that.
Yeah.
Um, when I got to the point where I was like, okay, I know God is true, and I started struggling through doctrinal issues, um, the stuff that's not that important, there were some scary moments where I didn't know if I believed what I grew up believing, but I also didn't know if I believed the other
Right.
the other opposing side to that. And
Right.
so I was stuck in this middle of like, I don't know what I believe. And it could have been easy for me to just be like, oh well, I give up. But I think it's important to keep reading, keep praying,
Yeah.
and actually seek the answers that
Y-
you're looking for. And it's
Yeah.
okay for it not to come in a 30-minute Google search.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I second that motion. Uh, Thinking through the challenges of um, the scripture says, God can be known when you seek Him with your whole heart. I think sometimes we don't know what it means to seek with our whole heart. Right.
Mhm.
Again, I want the 30-minute Google search. I want this. I'm in the middle of purchasing something right now that there's so many variations of this product that I'm about to purchase, right? There's so many variations, there's so many manufacturers, there's so many price points, and it's to the point where I'm almost like I don't even want it anymore because it's like
Yeah.
it's so much. Like if I get this one, is this one better than this one? And
Yeah.
and I and I and
The paradox of choice. You have way
exactly.
more choices, but it's way harder to pick something off the Whataburger menu than it is the In-N-Out menu,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, absolutely. I think there was a
Although I
study.
will say Whataburger's better than In-N-Out.
What a burger, baby! We in
Texas.
Texas. But that whole notion, I think it was Harvard Business that did a thing where they put 26 types of jellies in a store and people just didn't make a choice. And
Yeah.
then they narrowed it down to like six, and then people
Start to make more choices.
started to make more choices. And so, yeah, it's like there's so much out there that we could think or fathom or talk about, and it's exhausting to go through all these variables of choices. But I think that's one thing against today's culture, and I even fall prey of it. Like I would rather, like I like to create content. I love to preach on Sunday mornings, but sometimes I would rather watch Netflix or scroll on my phone than do those things, because those things take that whole I have to research. I have to, I have to do certain things, and sometimes it's just we get with so many things to do, it just gets exhausting. And so I would say I ditto that sentiment exactly. Uh, Take your time. Don't rush. Uh, Ask all the right questions. We said all that stuff before, and then understand this. Understand that and there is a truth to be known, and so drill down until you find that truth. Um, and of course, we're biased. We believe that that truth is found in Christ. Um, and then secondarily, I would say this as well. Don't get caught in the weeds. Like you just said, you didn't know if you believed what you grew up believing, but you also didn't know if you believed this other thing as well. Um, Try and find essential truth.
Yeah.
Uh, Again, and I hear the argument all the time, well, Christianity has all these thousands of different denominations, right? And yeah, I look at it like you're looking at some things often that are non-essential. Often, some people who claim to be Christian denominations aren't even Christians at all.
Yeah.
Finding the things that are essential and the things that are not essential, it's going to take work to find out the things that are not essential and focus on the essentials. Jesus told his told the guy who came up to him, he told this lawyer who approached him, he said, what's the greatest commandment? And Jesus said, I'll give you two. He said, first, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and then love your neighbor as yourself. I say start there.
Yeah.
Start there. Just loving God and loving your neighbor and allowing God to grow you over a lifetime. I can attest to SJ's comment earlier. He's only been on the planet for he's like 16 years old. I don't know what,
25.
okay, 16, 25, same thing to me. Um, like I've been alive twice as long as he has. And so I can attest to those moments that he talked about earlier going, man, when I was 25, I thought I knew something. And then when I was 30, I thought I knew something. And then when I was 35, I thought I knew something.
Yeah.
And now I'm 48 and I'm like, I don't even think the same about certain things in my life that I did when I was 46 at
Yeah.
48.
And
But
when
the
I was
essentials
23, I
remain.
was stupid.
You said, I know I was
And I'm
stupid.
only 25 now, and I'm probably still stupid, but
Yeah. Yeah. But but the essentials remain, loving God and loving my neighbor. I mean, yeah, loving God and loving my neighbors as myself.
Mhm.
Right. And then all the other things that I learned through life are it's not that I'm necessarily learning something different. I'm learning a deeper truth in a lot of ways. That I'm like, oh, I never looked at it from that angle. I'm finding
Yeah.
myself doing that a lot more nowadays. Like I never looked at it from that angle. It doesn't change the fact that it's still, a Kia that the Kia boys are stealing.
Yeah.
But oh, I never noticed the spoiler look like that. Oh, that makes it more beautiful. Oh, I never noticed the alloy wheels, right? Like I'm noticing other elements of it, but it's still the same essential thing. And so oftentimes when I see people deconstruct their faith, it's like, oh, I never knew that my car was a twin turbo. Now, what else do I have to worry about?
Yeah.
Kind of thing. That was a horrible analogy, but you get
I don't know cars, but it sounds right.
yeah. All these years, I thought my car was more powerful than it is, and it's not, kind of
Yeah.
thing. And it's like keep living, and you'll see where that type of motor is beneficial in some ways that this one isn't. That
Yeah.
was my intention of the illustration. Now I'm just beating a dead horse.
Yeah,
But okay,
I think we don't have the idea of truth, like it's your truth, my truth.
yeah,
Like they can be contradictory, but they're both valid. Um, and that's an idea that came from like postmodernism and now it's like seeped into our culture
yep,
today.
yep,
But I think that if we truly believe that there is truth and you can find that truth, then nothing would be able to stop you from trying to find it.
mm.
Um, Mr. Beast came to you saying Mr. Beast's name so that way maybe the algorithm will boost it.
Hold on. Who's Mr. Beast?
Oh, Mr. Beast is this guy. He's real cool. Anyways, but if he said, I buried $10 million in your backyard and you believed that he buried $10 million in your backyard, you're not going to like try dig like three holes and be like, ah, well, didn't find it. I guess I'm done. Right.
Right.
And I think that's sometimes what we do when we're trying to dig into scripture. We dig a
Mhm.
couple times, we don't get the answers we want, and we're just like, oh, well, okay, I give up. But if there was $10 million, and that pales into comparison with eternity in heaven, right? If there was $10 million, then we would do everything in our power to find that, I think, to keep digging, whether or
Right.
not we could, uh, yeah. But anyways, that's my point. I think we would do everything in our power to find it if we truly believe that there is truth and that we could know that truth.
Yeah. I'm in total agreement with you. So I believe objective truth exists. And then there's a tension as well that, often gets neglected when we talk about these things. And that is there's an element of, yes, there is a God of the universe, and there are also dark forces that don't want us to see light. And that's getting into this whole other thing that um, is challenging for us. And we need to understand as believers, like once you believe that there is dark forces that oppose you living your life the way that Christ wants you to live your life. Uh, and so speak to that for a moment. Like, what are some of the things that you've experienced as far as like warfare goes when it comes to the challenge of faith?
Yeah, I think sometimes we think that um, when we start to get closer to God, things are just gonna magically get easier. But that's definitely, well, I mean, hey, it's easier in some ways, but that necessarily hasn't been the truth because um, there is an evil one who wants to steal, kill, and destroy, and he's after you. Um, and he is working hard to make sure that you give up. He wants you to just give up and be comfy, right? And I think that that's his goal, and he's real good at getting you to that place of just being like, apathetic, right? Um, and so I would say that the important thing is to know that there's also someone that's trying to intercept that truth, and he's trying to take that from you. Um, and so that when it comes, you're not surprised or shocked by it, but you're able to um, defend against that, if that makes sense.
All right. So I was just asking about the level of understanding as a believer. Once we begin to believe, there is a force of darkness that shrouds the light. That wants no. Let me take that word back. Not shroud the light, but a force of darkness that opposes the light
Mhm.
and wants to keep us from living out our lives in a way that allows us to see the light for what it truly is. What would you speak to someone who's wrestling from that vantage point of it? Because oftentimes we often just think about the intellectual part of things, but forget that there's also a spiritual part of things.
Yeah. Um, yeah, we forget that the devil is coming in to steal, kill, and destroy,
Right.
and he wants to do everything in his power to get you to give up or just not, or just be comfortable enough to not even care,
Right.
really. I've noticed in my life some of the times when I feel closest to God is when there's the most attack from the enemy. And some of the times when I just feeling kind of cruising through life, apathetic, whatever it may be, in those times it's like I'm chilling. And I
Right.
don't even feel like I need to go to God, you know? Um, I would just say that if you use just know what your weapons are against that, so that you're able to use them. Prayer, reading the word, truth. If you're using those as your weapons, the darkness can't really have victory over you, in my opinion.
Right. As a believer, how how challenging is it for you sometimes to, or is it challenging for you sometimes to acknowledge that some of the things that we believe are hard to believe?
Yeah. Okay. So for me, I've never really been like, I've always been like more on the intellectual side of
Mhm.
things. I've never really been some of like the most, I guess, emotional side of things when it comes to faith. And so there are things that are like really, really hard for me to not try to intellectualize and be like, oh, well, what it really meant in the Hebrew was probably,
Right.
it's not really saying like this crazy stuff is happening. But I think there are things for all of us that are easier to believe and some things that are not as easy to believe.
Mm.
And they might look different from person to person.
Right.
Um, because we all have different strong suits and all our brains do work different in some ways. And so um for me, when it comes to like the spiritual warfare stuff, it's a battle for me to between like, oh, well, was that just my mental health or was that just this? And I think really what it comes down to is just believing that what God says is true
Mm.
and believing that the essentials of our doctrine to people on the outside seems crazy.
Mm.
So, like, for me, it's like if I truly believe that this is the God of the universe, nothing would sound too crazy, right? If this is the God who created everything around us, um, nothing's quote unquote too crazy for him. And so a lot of it is there's a lot of things that are super hard to even admit that are hard for me to believe.
Right.
But because I want to intellectualize everything. But I think that it's important to know, like you said before, the essentials. Uh, and some of the other stuff is like not necessarily like heaven or hell for you.
Right.
Some of the other stuff is like icing on the cake, if
Nice.
that makes sense.
I like icing on my cake,
Yeah, true.
bro. I mean, who doesn't like icing on the cake? Yeah, I find that I find that refreshing to hear. And I love the way you explained it when you said that basically, if he's the God of the universe, there's really not anything too hard to believe, right?
Yeah,
It's like when you think about it, we often make our intellect greater than God,
yeah,
right? So we're like we rationalize and we get to this truth that we feel like we found, and we go, well, if God was real, this wouldn't be this.
yeah,
It's like, wait a minute. Well, if it it's almost like with the theological frameworks, I found that a lot of theological frameworks put God in a box uh, because we're like trying to make God
yeah,
what He is, and it all starts with the essential at the beginning that we think is essential. We say God has to fundamentally, essentially be this. Then everything else is built outside of what we say God has to fundamentally, essentially be. And when Scripture tells us that, things like God is love, right? And so we say things like, well, if and I hear this a lot, well, if God is love, how is it merciful to do this?
yeah,
Right. So then we're taking our understanding of love and placing it upon God, right? Kind of thing. And God, he anthropomorphizes himself in a lot of ways in order for us to get halfway there. But I think a lot of times words just fail.
yeah,
Words just fail. And so um, I would like to see more discussions online and offline with people who are wrestling with their faith, with Christians who are patient enough to hear what they're saying. And then if they need, say, let's reconvene this discussion, let's talk some more, let's pray together. Um, let's find ways to help you with what you're wrestling with instead of just dismissing them. Because it's almost like, well, if you don't believe what I believe, then bye. Yeah,
yeah,
bye, kind of thing.
yeah,
And that's not cool either. That's not cool either.
yeah.
Um, anything else you want to say before we close out this first podcast episode of the new season of What in the Word podcast?
Yeah. Last thing I would say is if you're someone who someone is coming to who has questions, um, it's important to not try to muster up an answer if you don't know the answer. Oftentimes that leaves them with more confusion. And it's okay to say, I don't know the answer to that question because it also makes you feel more human. It makes you feel more approachable. It makes you feel like you're actually trying with me. You're actually trying to answer this question that I have rather than just give me the answer and be like, on your way now.
Yes.
And so um, it makes them not feel alone because they feel like, oh, well, this guy has questions too. So we can figure out those questions together um, rather than just giving them like a haphazard answer.
Oh,
And then that
Pat.
just leaves them like with more answers.
Yeah.
And they're just kind of like, I don't understand. Because
Yeah.
that's what was most helpful to me was asking people questions when I had all these questions doctrinally, because I went to a Lutheran school, but I wasn't Lutheran. I had all these questions. And one of the things that was the most helpful to me was when even my professors were like, you know what, I don't know the answer to that, but I'll get back to you on that.
Mm.
Or, oh, I don't know the answer to that. Because it just showed me like, oh, there's nobody who has all the answers. So it's okay for me to question. It's okay for me to ask these questions and have the not always have the answers to them all the time. And then at the end of the day, it was just when I get to heaven, I guess we'll know.
Well, no, right. Well, I'm glad you got a chance to go off to college and experience, those professors who didn't know anything. Because I know growing up in my household, you knew that I knew everything. which
Yeah,
was
yeah,
awesome sauce.
yeah.
Yeah,
Everything,
I
everything.
appreciate that.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for tuning in to What in the Word podcast. SJ killed it on his first time out. We're gonna have new content coming up, and so if you will tell us how you thought this episode went down in the comments, and drop us a line. Let us know if there's anything you want us to talk about. And until next time, we'll check you later.
Yeah. Peace out.
Peace out,
What in the
guys.
word?
Podcast.